One of the things we think a lot about is climate justice and how that bears out in rural communities, but communities all around the world. And there's so many different aspects to that. What kinds of aspects are you thinking about in regards to climate justice lately?
There's multiple things that come to mind. The first one is multi-generational aspects. How are we including multi-generational communities? How are we including people from different social determinant environments? Thinking about wealth disparity, knowledge disparity, but most important, how are we including the voices? Often in rural communities, voices are erased, or they're not uplifted loud enough, or we don't see the faces that match the voices. And so in order to create more of a collaborative, interdisciplinary change and create opportunities for people to be change agents, we need to think more broadly, more intergenerational, and also we need to think more about place-based knowledges.
Can you just tell me, what is place-based knowledge?
Place-based knowledge to me, what it really means to me is the knowledges in which you've acquired through your lived experiences. From an Indigenous perspective, I view place-based knowledge as something that's been around since time immemorial. Regardless of being displaced, we all have a level or multiple levels or multiple variations of place-based knowledges. The time in which you spend in community, transitioning from one moment of your life to another, we're always acquiring place-based knowledges. But for us to really dig our heels in and talk more about this concept of justice and climate change, we really need to uplift, talk about more about these place-based knowledges. That rural farmer that's been working in that area for over 20 plus years, and that may be generational. The new person that's in the community that could be a climate scientist that's invested in rural regenerative agriculture, or the new teacher who wants to introduce climate justice and concept about environmental health into a classroom curriculum. That's really important.
Do climate and health policies intersect or share part of the Venn diagram, or should we think about them distinct from each other? How do you see climate and health policies?
Health and climate policies are interchangeable. They're also of equal parts. You can't have one without the other. Air does not have any boundaries, neither does water, neither does the soil. So when we think about the massive amounts of fires that we're having, the particulate matter that travels from our Canadian borders or neighboring states, when there are massive amounts of very, very hot fires, it's invisible. But it doesn't have a particular permission slip to say, may I pollute this area, right? And particulate matter is something that we can't see, but we can no longer take the stance of out of sight, out of mind. We have an uptick of the amount of youth that have upper respiratory problems. We have huge amounts of vulnerable populations like the elderly, socially disadvantaged people, wealth disparity, communities that are having problems with having heating and cooling systems and appropriate air filters to even accommodate the fires that we're experiencing because of the droughts, the inappropriate practices. I mean, the list goes on and on. So when we think of climate and health, they must be thought of as piggybacking off each other. If we do not have healthy environments, we increase the amount of health disparities. So when you think of pipelines, extractive resources, where are these things are going to go? We're repeating history of genocide. So it goes back to climate and health. Climate and health are interchangeable because if you're utilizing methods, ways, and structures and plans that are still going to disadvantage already marginalized populations who have experienced genocide and still experiencing genocide based on environmental health disparities, we just keep repeating the same process and the pendulum just keeps swinging back in that same direction. My perspective is before we make these long-term solutions about how to put particular people in constant harm, we need to include the voices of these people.
One of my questions goes back to the young people you've been talking about, and also this idea that it's hard. It's hard to look around at the change that's bringing harm so often to people and communities and ecosystems and our other living relatives. But I'm also hearing you say that even young children need to be able to be part of these conversations. How do you hold all of that at the same time, not wanting to live in despair, but involving everyone in the conversation, even young people?
It's important to tell the truth. Truth always prevails. Through truth, you have hope. Through hope, you have reality. And the reality, starting with so many people weaving in all the different components of that web, that's where we create positive action. We can no longer say out of sight, out of mind. And our youth are seeing this. And we have to be very realistic. We have to educate our youth to be in the know and to know what's happening in the world around them. It would be so dishonest for us to pretend that they do not see what's going on. And I believe in our youth. They're not jaded. I know that our youth need to be able to articulate themselves in a conversation like we're having right now. And how do we incorporate our youth into these conversations? It's by they need to be present to witness change happen. So if we're going to have intergenerational inclusion into the decision process about climate justice, climate change, environmental health disparities, long-term, slow, healthy decisions, then we also need to model how we do these things in our communities, whether it's rural or urban, but we need to include our K through 12 school systems as well as our educators.
How does having a conversation bring us any closer to the future we're looking for?
We find relevance. We find a familiar voice, a familiar story, a familiar face. Far too long, our nation has been divided by race. Far too long has our nation been divided by generational wealth. Far too long have we been divided by political beliefs, religious beliefs. But when we come together and talk about a common cause that's so important, that's the change. We have to be able to move beyond the silos that we've created based on our ideas